So before we start with Boto3 and attaching our Lambda function to our database, I forgot to do one thing in our database from last time, and that was to change the capacity. So it turns out that I'm just going to go back to our table, chocolate user. There's a section called capacity, and by default there is read and write capacity units, and AWS puts in 5 for each, which is way more than we would ever need. And you'll see this value per month. If we just change it down to 1, which is more than we will need, we'll save a huge amount of our money, so we'll just change that. If for some reason you use a lot more capacity, you can always change those, and by that time you should be able to understand more about how to change those. So we're going to go back again to Lambda. Last time we were looking at our Lambda function, the hello world. We created this code that just returned a single variable as JSON. So we're going to take this as our starting point, and we're going to go back and we're going to create a new Lambda function, and this time we're going to call it get user info. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be sending over the email address of a user to the database, and then the database is going to return the entire row for that particular user, and we'll get all their profile information. Once again, we're going to pick Python, and once again we're going to choose use an existing role, and we're going to use that particular role that we created that will actually let us access the database, which was the reason why we created that. So we're going to create the function. We're going to go in here and just replace it with the code that we had last time. We can save that. We can create a test case just like we did last time. Once again, the key was name, and the value was my name. And we're going to call it test case 1, and we're going to create it. And now when we press test, it returns the parameter that we passed in. So now that we have it working from last time, what we're going to do is we're going to change up our code, and we're going to use this library called Boto3. So we're going to import. So Boto3 is a, sorry, not capitalized. Boto3 is a library from Amazon, and it lets you access any AWS services using Python code. So we're just going to change this up a little bit since we're not doing that anymore, and it's going to return a row from our So it's going to return a row from our DynamoDB database. And that's what this does also. So to access the database using Boto3, the first thing you have to do is tell Boto3 what service you're going to be using, and then return that as a variable so that that object has access to all of the particular service that you're interested in. So the service we are interested in is DynamoDB. So I'm actually just going to create a variable called DynamoDB, and that will hold the object that will allow us to access AWS DynamoDB databases. And I'm going to use the Boto3 framework, and I'm going to choose the particular resource that we are interested in, and the resource is DynamoDB. So that variable now will have access to DynamoDB. Once we have access to DynamoDB, we then have to pick out the particular table that we are interested in. So if we just go to DynamoDB, we have several tables. Well, actually at the moment we only have one. So this is the particular table that we're interested in. So we're going to have to pick out that particular table. So I'm going to create a variable called table, oddly enough, and we're going to use this object that gives us access to the database, and we're going to perform the method table. And which table are we picking out? And the table we are picking out, your best option is to copy it exactly so that you don't make any mistakes at all. And that is the name of the table. So this variable now has access to our table. So what we are going to do is we're going to use a particular function called getItem that is a method of table, and it will get the item that we are interested in, and it will return hopefully the row or some kind of message that will tell us what's happening. So we're just going to create a variable called response, and it is going to be assigned table dot, the method is called get item, and which item are we going to get? So the way get item works is that you pass it in a particular key from our database. So if we open up our database, sorry, go to items. If you pass it in the primary key, it will then return you the entire row. So what you have to do is in here, you have to say key, and then you pass in the particular key that you are interested in. And the particular key that we are interested in is called email. If you go back, you can see it's the name right there. And the particular value that we are interested in returning, you can just go back to the database and you can take a particular key. So actually I'm not going to take the first one. I'll take the second one just as proof that it worked properly. I can copy this. There we go. So I'm looking for that particular email address. And that's how it's formatted. So this variable will now hold the response from the database, and it will tell us, it will hold whatever the database gives us back. So I'm just going to put a print statement in here and print out the response. We're going to save that, and we're just going to keep the same test data even though we actually never used it in here. We're going to change this in a moment. We're just interested in the print response so that we can see what's going on and making sure that it actually works properly. So we're going to press test again, and we got an error for some reason. On line 13. Let me go just check line 13. Did I spell it correctly? I called it BD instead of DB, which would not make it work. let's just correct all those. Save that and try it again. And there we go. Okay, so it worked. Obviously the response never changed, but if we come back, sorry, to the bottom down here, it didn't print it out. Oh, yes it did. There we go. So it printed out this line here. You can see that it is a JSON file and it has one element called item, and then it has the item, and the item itself is a JSON file. Last name Smith, email is the email address we were looking for. So it did work and it returned what we were looking for. If we go in and we change John Smith to, say, I want Jane this time. So if we just put her in and say save and run it again, hopefully down here, you'll see we get Jane Smith. Now, the question is, what happens if it doesn't return a row? What happens if we say Jane 2 Smith? So we know there is no Jane 2 Smith in here, so it should return a 0 row. So we're interested in what will the output look like under item when an empty row gets sent back. So we press test, and you'll notice we got a completely different response. So the response is actually telling us that it actually didn't give us anything back at all. So, whoops. Sorry about that. So what we need to do is we need to trap these two different outcomes that could possibly happen. So the first outcome that happened was that an actual row came back in an element called item, and the second case was that no row came back. So probably our best bet is to use a try and except structure. So we're going to create a new variable called result, and it's going to return the response when we're looking at item. So if this is successful, that means that we actually did have an item, but the other case is the exception, and if that happens, instead of spitting back that strange row that tells us that we didn't get any row back, it would be nice if we just got back an empty result. So the result will just be an empty JSON file. So we're just going to remove this, and we'll place it down here. And instead of putting back the response, this time we'll spit back result. So if we actually did get a row, then that particular row out of the items column, the information we're actually looking for, will be held in here as a JSON file. And if there wasn't a row, then we just get an empty JSON file. So we're just going to leave it once again to Jane, and hopefully result will just be an empty file. So now when we come down, there is our empty file, and if we fix this so that we're just looking for Jane, and we press test, then we see the row that we're actually looking for. So the next thing we're going to do is, instead of hard coding this, which doesn't really make sense, what we're actually going to put in there is the parameter email address, which will be passed in as a parameter. So we'll just remove that. And just like we did in our Hello World program, we select the event parameter that comes from here. And this time, the key that we are looking for is email address. So that is going to have to come from our test case. So we're going to save that, and then we're going to update our test case. So we're no longer looking for name. We're looking, whoops, that was the wrong thing. We're now looking for email address, and one of the particular email addresses that we could use is Jane Smith. So there's our updated test case. Now when we run this, we should get back the exact same row, but it's being passed in as a parameter. So we're going to run it again. And we got an error on line 17. Email event email address. We'll just pause while I fix this. Okay, we're back. By the magic of editing, found out where the error was. So what I done last time is right here I had replaced the hard-coded value with event and then email address, and was using that as our test case where we had email address and we were passing in Jane's email address. Just going to save that to make sure it's okay. And when we ran that, we were getting this error. So once we've changed the parameter that's being passed in, this parameter no longer exists. So I'm just going to delete this so it'll just return hello, and click save and do the test again. And there we go. Now we have the row. And as a second test, if we go back to our test case and change it once again to an email address that we know doesn't exist and run the test, hopefully we now get the empty one. So that is now working and we're off and running. Last thing we need to do is take this result and pass it back in here. So instead of it being hello and whatever it is, it will just pass back the full JSON file. So we'll just save this, and at the moment it should just pass back that completely empty JSON file that's being printed out here. So when we run that and we scroll up to the very top and we look, there we go. We have our status code, which is good for the web, and we have an empty set being passed back. And if we come back here and we change it back to an email address that we know works, and we press test again, we get a horrible error. But I was expecting this. So here is the problem. It's this decimal. If we scroll down and we look at what's being passed back, this row right here, this JSON element, is well formed here. Last name is Smith, email address is this email address, first is Jane, and age is, well, wait a minute, this isn't normal JSON. So the way Boto3 passes back a decimal is by saying decimal and then putting it in brackets in single quotes. The problem is JSON does not like this, and that's why it broke. So what we need to do is we need to convert this so that it would just be the number 25 sitting there all by itself. So there's many ways you could do this, but I actually found a helper function online, and what we're going to do is we're just going to add in the helper function right here, and that hopefully will help us out. So I'm just going to grab that code, as I said, and I have it here. So I actually just got it off of this website. So I'm going to grab this function. We're going to go back and we're going to place it into our code. And you'll notice also that it is using this library about decimal, which makes sense because that was the problem we were having. So what this does is you pass in an object. In our case, it's going to be the entire JSON file result that we are trying to pass back. So not the original one that we got, but the one that we got back. And this magic right here will take it and strip out that decimal piece and just give us back what we want. So if it is correct what we got, then we're just going to do one other step, and we're going to take the result and we're going to pass it through the function. And that will hopefully strip out the nasty little bit right here that we're not interested in. So we're going to save that. We're going to run our test again. And you'll notice this time it worked. And if we scroll over, there it is. Age is 25. And if we scroll to the top, there's the output that we're looking for in the format that we're looking for. So now we have a fully functional JSON file coming out that from our Lambda function that was coming from our database, and that's what we were looking to get.